Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and right now we're going to go into our third lesson in basically the evolution of all life on Earth, the evolution of plants on Earth. And it's going to be this 400 to 300 million year span. And again, we are still 100 million years before dinosaurs even get here. We are unbelievably black. If you want to actually figure out, kind of like where human history is in terms of all this, like when cave people were around on Earth, according to fossil records, we're about 2 million years back. So we're right about there. Okay. And if you go 100 times further than that, and then go another 100 times further than that. So if you go literally 400 times that, as long as human beings have even been on Earth in the simplest forms as monkeys swimming for trees, that's how far back we're talking. And two things happen if you look at this time period and you look at it in close-ups. Let's go at a little bit closer up. Two main things happen. One, our oxygen continues to go up, and in fact, it goes farther up than it's ever been, and our carbon dioxide completely ditches. So we're going to start to understand that. The second thing that happens is our number of spore plants starts going down very, very fast. And all of a sudden, in the very, very end, we see the first gymnosperms actually come up. So that's what we're going to keep in mind. About 400 million years ago, that's when ferns developed roots, vascular tissue, and necessarily also, a little bit later, they developed leaves. So right now, in this 100 million time span, we get our first plants that actually look like plants. Roots, stems, leaves, vascular tissue, ferns. And then that ditches the CO2. Those leaves suck all the CO2 out of the air, pump lots and lots of oxygen into the air, and allow basically these ultra favorable conditions for a more advanced type of life at the very end, gymnosperms, to come in. What I want to focus on is not only the types of plants that evolved after moss, but why. What allowed ferns, this type of plants that evolved in this 100 million year periods, to be more successful than mosses were on land 100 million years before that? And why was it that it took until ferns to develop leaves? Why don't mosses have true leaves? Why don't mosses have true roots? Well, let's take a look. This is Temple Prasat Tapraham, and it's in Cambodia. And this temple isn't 450, 500 million years old. It's not even close. It's only a couple thousand years old. But this temple is actually a pretty good hint as to what happened when ferns evolved. Ferns come on the scene about 400-ish million years ago. And ferns have something that mosses don't. They have roots, and true roots. And at its surface, that doesn't seem like much, but if you look at this temple, here's all these roots, and these roots aren't in the ground, they're forming on bare rock. And in the thousands and thousands of years that this temple has had these trees' roots kind of grinding away at it, it started to form this at its base: dirt. Roots break up rock. And when you get tiny little particles of rock, over millions of years of stuff dying in it, eventually that makes soil. And that allowed roots is what allowed ferns to go farther than mosses onto drier and drier land, because soil holds on to water a whole lot better than bare rock does. So we have mosses still near the very, very edge of these super briny waters, but then we have ferns going way farther in now, way farther away from that water's edge. And we have them growing in something that they can anchor themselves to, and something that actually stores water for them in, so they can survive even harsher conditions than mosses could. So, ferns are what created the very, very first soil ever seen on Earth. And this allowed more and more plants to populate the Earth. And all of a sudden, with so much photosynthesis happening in the air, you get less and less O2 in the air. And ferns spread quickly, take over rock, grind it into soil, and basically start processing the earth and start really creating the earth from a barren rock bed into what we think of Earth as now, basically just a big ball of dirt. The problem is that with all that plants, all that photosynthesis, CO2 gets lower and lower and lower into the air. And keep in mind, that's what ferns and all plants need for food. So they needed to get better at absorbing CO2 from the air. So they did. The way they did that was they evolved leaves. Roots are what create soil and allow ferns to take over. Leaves allow there to be more ferns on Earth than there had been on any other part of Earth, that any other type of life had ever been on Earth ever before. These gigantic, what we call fern fronds, but what are in fact leaves, allow, better than mosses, better than any other life, the ability for ferns to suck every little bit of carbon dioxide out of that air and process it into food for them to eat. So that's it. I mean, that's really that next 100 million years. Again, 100 times that of how long we've been on Earth. We have ferns evolving from moss, right? Vascular tissue allows them to carry water, grow a little bit taller. No big deal, but the vascular tissue also allows transfer of water into the very, very first primal roots, which start the process of grabbing onto and grinding up rock, which doesn't hold water very well, into soil, which does. And all of a sudden, after a couple 100 million years of doing this, ferns can get away from that water's edge where they're bathed by whatever little water there is. And with more and more soil, more and more water holding capacity, you get larger and larger ferns and better ferns, stronger and stronger ferns, farther and farther away from the edge of that water. Unfortunately, with all of those ferns populating all of the Earth, CO2 gets really, really low. So ferns, due to their own success, need to be the first organisms that evolve leaves to help process and scrape the atmosphere clean of what little CO2 there is, which allows there for the first time in Earth's history for there to be more oxygen in the air than there is carbon dioxide, which is really the situation now. All right, in the next chapter, what we're going to start talking about is we're going to start talking about gymnosperms, the first seed plants. We're going to talk about how they came about and really why they became about the way they did, why they started growing taller, why they developed seeds to begin with, what factors actually, or what are called evolutionary pressures, really pushed gymnosperms to turn into the conifers and evergreens and Christmas trees that we see today.